Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay and welcome to episode 12. We're going to dive really in depth into how to work remotely from home or you're in office, whatever you want to do. I've worked on many feature films doing this and I want to talk about how to get into this and how to approach it, how to start it, how to do it all. So let's dive into this right now.
Welcome to the Allan McKay Podcast. Allan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Allan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Allan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on allanmckay.com.
Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay and welcome to episode 12. Really psyched to finally be back in LA and finally have all of my travels for the year and the upcoming future out of the way as well. It's been fun to attend Autodesk University and attempt to have a vacation. I ended up working the entire time, but for me, it's just a chance to kind of really focus and have a bit of a routine again, which I think is pretty crucial. And it's actually something I'm going to be getting into next episode, along with a lot of other really cool information. This episode is hopefully going to be a pretty valuable one for a lot of people, and hopefully it kind of changes a few people's lives and how they look at a lot of how they work and how they do things. Now, what this is going to be about is working from home or working remotely. This is a pretty big subject, and it's also a little bit taboo, I think, as well, just because the whole mindset of not working from the office for a lot of people can either be a dream or it can be a bit of a nightmare, and especially for a lot of people who hire staff, to have them not in front of them can be a little bit discomforting. Now, there's a lot to cover, and for me, I imagine this episode is more going to be a little bit more of an overview of it, and depending on how much of a response I get, I might go a lot more in depth and kind of spend a few episodes going through literally step by step how to go from either working from an office to breaking free and be able to work and set up your own place, or if you're freelance, then reestablishing yourself as more of an entity so that way you can go after that work. And of course, beyond that, moving into launching your own studio for the more ambitious people who want to do that. Now, that's a whole other conversation, but I think this is definitely a step in the right direction. So there's lots to cover, and I will try and go through these rapid fire. Like I said, this will be more of an overview rather than it being necessarily a in-depth how-to hands-on guide. Now, the reason that I've got a lot of experience talking about this is that I've been working on and off, I think for about a decade now, remotely for myself. And this all started probably in 2003 when I was working on Scooby-Doo 2 and also the John Woo film Paycheck. Now, I worked with them for a client of mine, and I did that entirely from Australia as I just moved back there. And that was interesting, and it was definitely had its challenges. And beyond that, I started working a lot more for remote studios. Most of my clients have always been in LA, whereas I've sporadically, at least in my younger years, always gone back to Australia. I'd have those moments where I miss home and want to go back and see my family and friends and everything else. And it always meant that there wasn't always that much work in Australia. I think that's kind of changed a little bit now, but it meant that I would need to bring the work to me. And that was always a challenge because especially LA has always had this mentality of you need to be in the LA bubble. And if you're not living in Los Angeles, then you pretty much don't exist. And that's definitely changed over the years. But for the longest time, even being in New York, it would pretty much be like living on the other side of the planet. So you need to be where the work is, and you need to be inside of Los Angeles. Now, that began to change, and now especially the work is kind of going elsewhere, and it's more the people in LA who need to chase the work, which I think is kind of funny to kind of look at the reversal of it. But that being said, it's definitely been a challenge to be able to get both the confidence of the studios you work with, as well as be able to get the work. There's been a lot of different challenges here. Now, since then, I've worked on over 150 projects remotely, and that is initially working from my apartment in Australia all the way through to owning my own studio and producing shows, as well as doing a lot of 3D myself. In the later years, even living in Los Angeles, sometimes even 2 or 3 blocks away from the studio, I've still always stayed working for myself. And for me, it's more came down to a pipeline and workflow thing where I can do a lot more. I can get a lot more done. And the way I work, the custom and proprietary software and tools that I've developed or I've acquired have allowed me to get a lot more done a lot faster, I think, than if I were to adapt to other people's pipelines. And there's pros and cons to this, and I actually will go through a lot of this. It's definitely got its benefits as well as sometimes a lot of disadvantages to working by yourself. And for me, it's always just been more, that's how I like to work, and it gives me a lot of flexibility. And it just means that I can be able to focus a lot more on a lot more stuff using my own hardware and everything else. But some of the films I've worked on include like Superman Returns, Transformers 3, Flight, more recently The Equalizer, Metallica, Warcraft, dozens of other projects over time. And this is definitely the future of where things are going. The more as technology improves, and also just as things start to really globalize a lot more to the point where you have so many amazing artists in China, in India, in Russia, France, Germany, and all these people, Australia, New Zealand, obviously. Now, having them in all these different locations, there's always the overhead of dealing with visas, relocation fees, everything else. So if you want to acquire a really talented artist, typically it ends up coming with a massive, massive price tag on top of getting them there. And that is all the other time requirements and everything else that come into it, as well as obviously waiting. If you need someone really good, getting them into, especially, let's say, the US in a small amount of time, you usually need to wait 6 months, 8 months, a lot of work, a lot of lawyers. It's not something you can just click your fingers and have them arrive on your doorstep. So there's different reasons and benefits to it, but at the same time, like being able to just call someone up and say, we've got this project, can you do it? And literally just give them the task and then have the work come back. That's a huge advantage. It's fire and forget, and that's what you want, but you're not always going to get that, and that's why it's a bit of a gamble. There's a lot of, I think, angst and discomfort that comes with hiring people from, externally from your office, just because you don't know whether or not the work's going to actually get done. Now, obviously, I did a episode recently with Todd Sheridan Perry, who covered a lot of really great stuff. When we initially talked, I kind of approached him with, okay, well, let's do an interview, but rather than just chatting about it, let's give it a theme, because I don't want it just to be a straight up interview about your work and everything else, because I think that it's really great to cover that, but I do want to theme everything too, because I love to hear about how people made their successes and got to where they are, but at the same time to actually kind of cover a more consistent theme. That's what I really wanted to do. And right away, he already knew what he wanted to say, and that was working from home. And I always intended to do this episode because for me, this is something that I find very important. It's also something that I think everyone wants to do in theory, but they're not really aware of some of the problems that come with it. So it's more to educate people about it. And for the ones who really want to do it, then I will definitely give them the keys to the kingdom and help with that, with step-by-step guides on how to approach it. Even as I actually put out today for everyone on my VIP mailing list, following up from the last episode, I emailed out a couple of email scripts, so actual breakdowns of how to approach studios for work. So these are actual breakdowns explaining literally line by line why I've said things, what I've done, a lot of invisible threads on tactics to be able to get something without necessarily needing to ask for it. And already looking at my email, I haven't had a chance to read it, but just looking at the contents, it's already blown up. I've gotten, I don't know how many responses already about that. And that's what I want to keep doing, is I'm going to be sending out for the people who show that initiative, who show that they want to step up and make an impact on their career. In other words, the guys who sign up for the list, I'm going to be sending out a lot of really great content for that. So if you're interested, sign up, and I'll be definitely sending out more free PDFs and other great information that's exclusive to that list and probably won't see the light of day outside of that anywhere. Now, all of that being said, Todd was a great one to interview because of the insight he gave, and we also touched on a lot of really great subjects. Now, I want to kind of continue on from there and give my take on this, because this is something that I've been adamant about, and it's partially one of the subjects that when I started this podcast, I wanted to cover, and I think this is going to be really exciting. There are some studios out there that are trying to go completely virtual, and they are trying to set themselves up so that way they may have their main office who brings the work in, and then like a body shop, they will strip it all down and then get all the pieces out to all the necessary places and then reassemble it all at the headquarters. This is definitely one of those situations where it will progress, it will get better, but it's definitely going to have to go through growing pains to get there. But I do find it to be a pretty exciting subject, and just to kind of see the progress and the success that some of these studios have had. Now, I'm going to elaborate on a lot of this stuff a lot more in depth in a few future episodes, like I said, but let's just start to move into the actual core contents of working from home. Now, let's just dive in here. I'm just going to start with this. This isn't for everybody. Okay, it might sound really luxurious at first to dive in and be able to work, at your own whim, to get that kind of responsibility. Keep in mind that essentially when you step outside the studio or the office, away from your clients, whether you're a freelancer or whether you're an employee, you now will be essentially functioning as a studio. So that includes all the overhead and having employees in some situations, as well as now handling a lot of the business, as well as being the artist. So it's a lot more work instantly, and you will need to actually accommodate that. So a majority of people would prefer to actually be an employee because it's a lot easier. You just need to show up for work. You just need to be, told what to do every day, and that's completely fine. Now, there are some of us that don't want to have the boss and want to be the boss ourselves, and it's more for the sake of having that status of owning a company or being in control of that or having that responsibility, and that's what it really comes down to. Now, doing the work and staying on top of it all and really having a head for the business side, that's something that a lot of people don't take into consideration, and it's more about, great, yeah, I'm going to get my own thing going, and it's going to be awesome. I'm going to be the man. You get into that, and that's when everything goes to crap. Now, you need to keep that in mind, because it can be something that the idea is a lot better than actually doing it. Buying a bar, I watch the show Bar Rescue with John Taffer all the time, and for me, I always find that funny because there are so many people on that show that, I've, just like everyone else I know, we all have that idea of like, man, I would totally love to own a bar. And for me, at least, I think if I owned a bar, I would definitely hire people who have their head in it and also are going to give it all their attention, because I don't want to play bar owner. I don't want to try and do something like that. And watching shows like that, it kind of proves the point that a lot of people want to buy the idea, but to actually do it and to be good at it, that's something you need to kind of reach inside of your soul and kind of figure out whether or not you actually are capable of doing it, as well as want to really do it. Because working for yourself is definitely a lot more about management, and it's a lot more about self-control. It's a lot more about you suddenly having to put on a few different people's hats. You're not necessarily just an artist anymore. You're a manager, you're IT, you're a producer, you're the junior artist who has to do all the grunt work. Now, you can expand on this and start to hire other people, and essentially the more you get into this mentality, the more you will start to grow and become a studio on your own. Eventually, you'll start bidding on shows. Eventually, you won't have necessarily the clients that you had before, which were your old employer or something like that. You'll start competing with them and you start to grow. But at the same time, as you start to get closer to signing the $7-figure, $1 million checks, you're also going through the stress and the liability that comes with it too. And that's why I'm just putting this out there right now, that there are a lot of people who want to play boss, who want to have the idea of like, I can do whatever I want. And when it comes down to it, it's going to be a lot more work working from home or working remotely than it is working for an employer. An employer, worst case situation, you have to deal with the politics. In other words, if there's a manager or a producer or a supervisor, someone you don't like at your work or whatever it's going to be, that's typically what you have to deal with, is the friction of maybe things not being run how you think they should be run. But all the liability, all the things that you would otherwise have to deal with, you don't need to worry about. All you need to worry about is showing up and being told what to do. And of course, in these situations where the workplace isn't as great as it should be, you've got to deal with those politics. But again, that comes down to how you want to work. If you want to put up with being told to work crazy hours and everything else. I wrote the 2 articles, Overtime versus Productivity, which I think covers a lot of this and how to really maintain yourself and be able to work more effectively and efficiently. And again, all of this is leading up to, if you want more of this, I will laser focus in on a lot of these subjects and help with negotiating money, help with negotiating more freedom and responsibility, whatever you guys want. There's such a deep subject here that it's more right now scratching the surface. Now, there are a few of us that actually are right for this job. In other words, we want to work for ourselves for valid reasons, which is I can get a lot more done. My life situation isn't the same. I have dependents I have to take care of at home or whatever it's going to be. Maybe you just want the freedom to be able to travel and do your job. Or sometimes you might actually want to handle multiple jobs at once. And I do this a lot. Just because I have one project coming in doesn't mean I'm not doing a few projects at once and managing and scheduling them the same. And typically I will bid projects and schedule them that way. I might say, okay, well, these are the delivery dates and it's a bit longer than usual, so that way we have more back and forth freedom. But it also means that I'm not going to be entirely devoted to this project 24 hours a day. I've got other things going on. The good thing is that way you have multiple revenue streams and it's a chance to really grow and kind of keep that momentum going. Now, having that mentality, having the right mindset going in is really important, because it's very easy to get in deep and then realize that things are going to go to hell and you're buried in this. And seriously, when you get to the point where things have gotten big enough, you're then dealing with a lot more responsibility as well as the consequences. Now, for me, I've worked both at a studio, I've worked as an effects TD as well as a supervisor. I've directed commercials in New York and a few other places. I've produced a lot of shows. I've also worked more in pipeline and consultation. I've done a lot of stuff. I've also worked a lot remotely as well as on site, as well as on set. But more importantly, a lot of the experience that I got, especially when it came to stepping up my game and owning a studio, running a lot of higher productions, all came from initially working for myself. Because as soon as I started doing that, basically being really disorganized, really just jumping around, trying to put fires out over and over and over, you realize it's not going to work. And the more projects you have coming in, the more you realize you need structure in your life. So bit by bit, I started to kind of get more into the mindset of managing shows and, suddenly having several spreadsheets open, looking at what kind of database I should use to start to kind of feed all my stuff in. Luckily now we have Shotgun, which definitely alleviates some of the tension, being able to put everything into a universal system that is also now industry standard. So there's a lot of benefits to it, but the more you get your head into thinking like a producer, and again, I think that there is a lot of people out there who have this mentality of, I don't want to manage, I'm an artist, that's all I should do. But that's why I keep coming back to, you are a business, and the more you have a business mind, the more you're able to think about how you work and how more effectively you can work. Now, next episode, I'm actually going to cover a little bit more about how to manage yourself better, how to get more time out of your day. I think it's going to be a really exciting and interesting subject because it's a little bit left field. We're going to be doing a bit of crazy stuff in there, but this is all about that, having a better work mentality as well as a better living mentality, getting on top of your career in every way you can. And having that knowledge of like working and thinking like a producer, you tend to start to both structure how you work as well as look at from the perspective of the end game. And any good producer isn't really as focused on micromanaging you, because that's not what they want to do. What they want to look at is the finishing line and make sure that everything is going to land on the finish line exactly when it should be. And for them, the biggest worry is always going to be whether or not there's going to be any curveballs, whether or not there's going to be any emergency disasters and fires to put out. And that's when you do find if producers are micromanaging you and asking where things are, it means that you're probably somewhere along the way gave them reason to make them feel like they need to keep an eye on you. Now, that's not always the truth, because there are definitely, like in any area, people who just do micromanage and they're always on everyone's butt, and that's because they have a harder time kind of letting go and stepping back. But the more you give confidence to people about what you do and that you're capable, and the more that you can talk to them in the producer language, as I'm going to say, but the more you can talk that way, the more they're going to have confidence in what you can do and kind of step back and give you free rein to deliver what you need to, because they know that you have based on your track record. So all that being said, some of the key reasons behind working from home is obviously no commute. You don't need to travel every day. You don't need to worry about necessarily getting up early to go through crazy traffic and everything else. Another key thing is just the fact that you can kind of structure your day how you need. And, in some places there are pretty strict work rules. And then obviously in this industry, there's a lot of freedom as well. So just in some cases, it might be a situation where you don't want to work directly with certain people because there's friction or there's other reasons behind it. Sometimes you just want to work more effectively, quicker, and be able to work at your own pace. Maybe you're a night person or whatever it's going to be. I did know someone at a studio that went to the owner of the studio and basically said that they smoke a lot of weed and that's how they need to work. The guy was a programmer, and he basically said that he needs to smoke weed to actually get his work done. Now, that was a situation where the owner was like, well, I need you, but I can't have you doing that on the premises. So the guy ended up working from home. And, that's definitely not the way to approach it. But in this case, the guy was brutally honest. And he said, this is how I work. I get really stressed, a bit of ADD. So this was just my solution for it. And so, for him, he ended up working remotely. And I've known even guys at ILM who work from Australia, as well as Pixar as well. So as far back as Australia, they can work remotely doing what they do. And it all comes down to how you propose doing it. I think one of the big advantages, especially in this day and age, for working remotely is going to be the fact that you can be region free or location free. Essentially, you could work from any country on the planet and do your work. So I know there's a lot of people who kind of feel like because they're in a remote country that doesn't have a massive industry, that they're kind of stuck and they can't work for other companies and they have this big disadvantage. And I know from my life story, I always kind of felt like I was at a disadvantage because there's people I know who were born in the States, and I kind of felt like the heart of the visual effects industry was always in Hollywood. And so just being able to be born into a place where all the work is, you have that advantage rather than having all these barriers you need to break down to get there. Now, obviously, in this day and age, you have the freedom to be able to work from anywhere you want. Now, I don't think that's necessarily going to be something you can do right away. And I was going to address this later on, but this is a question I've been asked a few times, especially since that recent episode, which was, is it possible for me to work remotely for other studios at the beginning of my career? Now, I strongly think that this isn't possible. It's not a good idea. I think that you will meet clients and companies that will hire you and say, okay, work for me remote, do the work for me this way. I think that there's probably a lot of reasons why this isn't a good idea. Now, again, this is something I'm going off the top of my head about, but I think that obviously the big one is, can you actually do the work? Now, doing the work is one thing, but the more experienced you get, the more you're going to realize that, there's issues that come up about delivery, about everything, and just promising that you can do the work and thinking that I'm at a level I can do the work is definitely, there's always going to be curveballs. There's always going to be things that come up, and you don't want to promise something and then not deliver. There can sometimes be even lawsuits involved and other things like that. It's highly unlikely, but you just don't want the reputation of not being able to deliver what you promised. Now, that being said, at the same time, the more experienced you get, the better you're going to get with gauging your clients. Again, the clients, the companies who are willing to give you work right away, knowing that you don't have that much experience, for them it's more about you. Okay, you can do 3D, great. Well, we need one of those people. For me, that kind of instantly is a bit of an alarm bell, because for me, it means that they probably aren't too experienced with what they're doing, that they literally just trying to fill the slot of we need 3D rather than going through the proper layers that they need to go through. So that would always make me want to gauge them as a client. Okay, well, how experienced are they? Are they aware of the process? Do they know what they're doing? What's their level of expectation? Now, at the same time, who are they, and whether or not I'm going to get paid? Now, the only time I've ever, I believe, not gotten paid was a job I did when I was 14, which was I got an IRC, which is Internet Relay Chat. Back in the day, someone said they needed like a model done, and I ended up modeling this big lab coat for them for a commercial. It's like $250. Sent them the model, never got paid for it. I've been pretty lucky, but I've had a lot of friends who've done work and not gotten paid. I've also had recently one client who took a year to pay, but eventually they paid. It's just more, you've got to go through those situations occasionally. And that's why I think it's good to gauge your clients as much as they gauge you. And starting out, you are a liability. If you jump in and say that you're going to do all this stuff, you're going to do a music video or a feature film, you need to learn to say no to things. And I've learned this more recently than ever. Saying no rather than saying yes, it's difficult to do, but at the end of the day, it can be night and day different to like what the outcome of your life is going to be for the next few months. And I think that in the beginning, when you don't have that experience, you need to grow that experience. There's a lot of things that come into what you do that you'll benefit from in the long run if you go in, do the hard yards, and then later, step up your game. I meet so many people who do 6 months in the industry and then they start demanding, $100 an hour and like all these other luxuries. And I urge everyone, like, you need to do the hard yards. You need to get taken advantage of. You need to go through the brute force, long days and hell, and do 10 years or do at least 3 to 5 years, and then start to kind of evaluate where you're at. And I think that those first few years are crucial in carving you into who you are. And I roll my eyes whenever I do meet the people who are like ready to be the rock star the day that they sign up for doing 3D or doing whatever they are. And again, this doesn't just apply to visual effects, but you need to do the hard yards before you step into all this. I've gotten a few emails from studio owners in the past couple of days about the episode I put up about working remotely with Todd Sheridan Perry. Now, they were also voicing how they've had issues with people working remote, and it's not always the best thing. And looking from things from a studio point of view, I agree. I've hired plenty of people, and they've basically not delivered what I pay them for. And I'm always stuck in the situation where I always feel like I want to take care of my staff. I'm always going to pay what they did. However, then I'm screwed because I literally come out at a loss. Sometimes I've got to pay for the project myself because I've hired people who committed to doing something, and then when it comes time to actually delivering, they don't deliver the quality that I want, or they just don't deliver at all. And in those situations, it means that, okay, great, I've still got a budget, I've got to pay these people, I've still got to get the actual work done myself and get it delivered on time, and I'm still getting the exact same budget I quoted for, which means that essentially it all comes out as a loss. And because of that, I've had to go through a lot of learning over the years about dealing with this, and there now is only certain people I would trust to work remotely, and even then there's set ways that I would work with them, as well as a valuable one for studios' point of view. Always make sure that you have access to the files. In other words, they need to be publishing all their stuff on your server, because I've had literally on the day of deadline or day of delivery, employees just disappear. In other words, they're not reachable for a day or two because of whatever reason, and that's great, but it doesn't help me at all. And something that will be consistent with a lot of what I say is to always put yourself in the eyes of your employer or the people around you. In other words, figure out your obstacles, because if you start to look at things from their perspective, the more you're going to understand what their hesitation may be. And if you're able to understand that, which might be simply that they just don't see you every day doing your work, so therefore there's like this level of discomfort about like, what the heck are you doing? And that is something that can always cause a lot of major issues. So this is just something to keep in mind, that make sure that you do put yourself in the shoes of the person you're approaching. Think of the obstacles or the reassurance they need before you approach them, because that hesitation is really key. And I've mentioned this before, and I will continue to in a lot of different areas, because whenever you communicate with people, you need to start to look at what their needs and their wants are, what they are seeking, because if they have any discomfort with the ideas that you're proposing, then that's going to be an issue, and it will lead to them saying no. If you are able to address what you think the problems are going to be before they actually think of them themselves, then suddenly it's a lot easier to get that yes out of them. So if you approach someone and say, I want to work remotely, I know that constant communication is very important, so what I suggest is that we set up a schedule, we have reviews twice a week, however each day I'll send you updates with where everything's at, blah blah blah. By doing something like that, it instantly will remove that level of like, well, I don't know what you're going to be doing every day. And suddenly you get to see that. And you also, if you give them a termination date, in other words, let's trial this for a few weeks and then reevaluate where we're at. And that way, they can say, okay, well, this decision I'm making isn't permanent. We're just trying it out for a couple of weeks. What's the worst that could happen? So doing those little things can definitely make a massive impact on the outcome, whether or not they're going to say yes, or whether or not they're going to turn around and say, I feel really uncomfortable about this because it's a permanent thing and because they don't know what the heck you're going to be doing or how you're going to be delivering it. The more you can give them, the better it's going to be. Now, a couple of things I'm just going to rattle on about now just really quickly, but there are major disadvantages to working for yourself, okay? And that's something that most people don't keep in mind. I'd rather educate you ahead of time about this, because the idea by itself sells it. Yes, I'd love to work from home. I can work in my PJs, I can play video games all day long. That sounds awesome. I'll get the work done no matter what. So that sounds really, really awesome. But here's a couple of the things that you got to deal with. The fact is that if you're working remotely, then first of all, you don't have anyone seeing what you're doing. No one's able to gauge the productivity that you're having. So because of that, it's very easy to kind of get people uncomfortable with what you're doing, because especially if you're being paid an hourly rate and you're delivering stuff, even if you're delivering the same or more than other people, physically seeing that person there is obviously going to account for a lot of it. And for you to be remote and be kind of giving just the finished pieces or whatever else, a lot of people will always kind of have that mentality of like, yeah, he's probably not doing the work that he should be doing. He's probably goofing off. There's just a lot of unknowns with it. And so the key thing I really think is to give reassurance to what you're doing, cover what you're doing. I'll mention this in a little bit, but a mastermind group that I'm in and meet up with regularly, there's a guy who's having this issue, and that's one thing I addressed with him was basically, if you have yourself working remotely as an employee, not as a studio or an entity, but as an employee, what I always suggest is to write an email, each day, just kind of updating everyone on what you're doing, where things are at, estimates on how things are going. If that's too much, then every second day. But by giving these, like, kind of dripping out this information, it can be very effective, because then they have a better understanding of what you're up to, what you're doing, and you're keeping them constantly updated. And at the same time, you do need to kind of cover your butt. So by having all these emails come out, if anyone ever does say, hey, you know what, we have concerns about you working remotely, we're not really sure what you're doing, you can say, look, here is a weekly update of 5 emails a week or 3 a week, saying everything I've been doing. So if you match the progress I've done as well as the work I've been putting out, I've been getting more done than XYZ. So it's more about covering your butt, and that's one thing I will get into as well. And these are kind of quirky things, but you will always have the politics too, like people who don't see what you're doing every day. They don't necessarily know you as well, And there's always going to be the angst of the person working remote. And it's also something too that's very easy for the person not working there to actually get the blame for a lot of things. I mention this because let's say you are delivering work and then somewhere along the way your assets aren't working out, or your renders aren't, something's not quite working out. It's very easy for someone to say, okay, well, the reason is because that person like gave me really bad assets and I need to go fix them all. It sounds really petty and dumb, but this is the kind of thing that you deal with day to day and anywhere you work pretty much. The thing is that you aren't there to defend yourself. You're not there to say, you know what, here's my work. It's totally fine. This person obviously is having issues with this, and this, or whatever it's going to be. Most of the time, you won't even know about what's going on, and all they're getting is the experience that's one person reporting that information. Now, I mention that because that can be interpreted a lot of different ways, and it really comes down to just being aware that, this can be an issue. You need to be able to communicate the quality of work that you're doing and make sure that there aren't any, miscommunications, because maybe it's not intentional, but someone doesn't know how to handle your assets. I'm going to get through this stuff pretty quickly, but I will get onto that as well about best ways to deliver your work, because just uploading stuff to the FTP and letting the production coordinator download it, then one of the artists picks it up and starts to work with it. There is such a big area of miscommunication, misinterpretation. A lot of things can go wrong, and a lot of time gets wasted when it comes to doing that. I remember in Superman Returns, we had a deadline for Comic-Con when Superman Returns was being announced at Comic-Con. And I was working on some very cutthroat stuff that needed to get done. And it was one of the situations where I had been delivering all my stuff every day, getting through a lot of stuff. Finally, when I spoke with the VFX supervisor on the project, we were right up at the deadline, and the supervisor was actually looking at the work saying, look, I've been looking at the stuff for the past week and it hasn't been updated. It keeps coming out the same. We've been asking for all these changes and nothing has changed. So for me, I'm like, well, I've been addressing every single change, getting all the stuff done. Finally, after looking at the final takes, I realized that even though I'd been updating all of the work I've been doing, uploading it every day, the work that was being put into the comp, in other words, the artist who was taking my elements and updating them, rendering them out into the comp, hadn't actually updated it in like a week. So it's just assumed that, these are the latest elements every single time it's being looked at. And because that one person basically either had forgotten or lazy, whatever the reason would be, my elements stay the same. So, again, little simple issue, but because of that, without you there to say, oh, okay, like why are my elements not in there because you're not in the meetings, it's very easy for someone to say, what the hell, like what's this guy doing, because of that miscommunication or lack of. So there's a lot of things that can go into it, and it's more, like I said, about covering your butt and making sure that you have that constant communication. So delivering assets to people, I find it's one of the biggest time wasters, because you are uploading, let's say, a 3D file. They need to open it. They need to figure out what's going on, interpret it onto their network, get everything repathed, reworking, figure out what the hell you were thinking at the time. There's constant room for miscommunication, and there's a lot of downtime too, from the upload through the coordinator, through to the 3D artist, through to then getting rendered and interpreted and everything else. So that can be a major issue. So I'm going to go through a few solutions about that later on, which from experience of working and trying to find the best solution, what really works. But I'm just going to quickly mention a couple other things. These are more to do with the problems that you're going to go into. And one of the big issues is the fact that there is no end of day. There's no point in the day where someone's going to tell you that, okay, it's 6 o'clock, time for you to go home. You're going to continue to work, and I'm going to tell you that this is the case. You're going to continue to work because there's never that that observation of other people around you, seeing that them as a group are all leaving for the day and it's time to kind of start to wind down and detach yourself. So working from home can be very unhealthy because there isn't that, chance to switch off and go back to having a life. You end up going and having dinner with the family while your renders are working, and then coming back to your desk to check on them later at night, you're getting up in the middle of the night during deadlines, there isn't that detachment. Okay, so I think it's very important to keep that in mind, that you need to find that structure and to find a way to say, these are my designated hours, but at the same time, when I'm working, I'm working. I'm not working, taking a break, playing some video games, and, just kind of sporadically going about your day. And at the same time, another one, which I've felt myself, is that you don't have that validation. You don't do your work and then submit it for a review and have people say, like, that was great, or, this isn't working, this is, looking good. You don't have anyone to tell you that you're doing a great job. It's very easy to kind of have that insecurity that the work you're putting out isn't any good. I've had that, especially in the earlier years where I'd be working on like Superman, other projects where everything you do, and maybe it's just me, but like everything you do just isn't good enough. And like, as soon as people see it, it's going to look crap. It's not going to work. You're embarrassed by, the work that you're putting out, the level of quality. Of course, when you put it out, everyone's like, wow, this is awesome. Great job. And for, half a day, you feel good about it. And then you switch back to that mentality. And that's definitely more of an insecurity that not everyone's going to have. But I'm just saying that I've experienced that before. And it's more because I'm not around everyone else to kind of gauge what's going on and how things are working, as well as have that feedback and everything else. So it's very easy for you to start to think in a lot of really weird mindsets. And even being by yourself, like working by yourself, is by definition very unhealthy. You're lonely, and that actually is something that I go through, not in the sense that I'm feeling lonely, but I definitely have, probably once or twice a year, I will stop working and I'll go work for another studio just for the sake of having human interaction. So last year I worked on Destiny. I supervised that, and I did that because I wanted to get out and I wanted to have a chance to interact with other artists. I find it really exciting and also really motivating to be around other people and kind of all feed off of each other, and that's something I really miss. So when I supervised that show, it was about 3 months working with a big team of people. It was really great. And then I went back to working on Metallica and a bunch of other shows. This year I did the same thing. I went off and worked with Blair Studio on Halo, another Microsoft project, just because I wanted to have a chance to collaborate with a team of people. So that was really fun to kind of get that detachment again. Beyond that, January, I'm going to go work on the other top 3 game in the world, whatever that may be. But basically, again, like just having a chance to collaborate with people. So for me, it's more about sporadically working for a while and then taking a break and working again with other places, because you actually want that interaction. I think it's very important. And also, we all learn from each other and feed off of each other. So that's a massive disadvantage that you have by not working on site with other people around you. Another big challenge is just staying focused. That's why I think structure is really important. One of the most difficult things, I remember Chris Bond, who's the president or the founder, the owner of ThinkBox Software, does Deadline, Krakatoa, a lot of really amazing software. I remember him telling me back when he owned Frantic Films, and I was about to go off and work remotely with them, that working from home is one of the most difficult things you'll ever do. And I remember at the time being like, yeah, no problem. And over time, like the more, and especially the higher up you get and the more responsibility you get, it's definitely a very, very hard thing to do, to kind of keep yourself focused and not allow everything else to get in the way. Being able to gauge your progress and kind of mimic what other people are doing. When you're in a room with other people working, it's kind of easy for you to mimic that yourself and start to work just as much as they do. But when you're by yourself, it's very easy to be like, you know what, there's a PlayStation in the other room. I could just go and do that for 5 minutes. And then, Sons of Anarchy, final episode, gonna do that for a little bit. Suddenly it's like 4 p.m., you got nothing done. Then it's like, okay, well now I gotta work through the night to catch up. Having also your partner living with you as well, they sometimes, I'm lucky in my situation here, but I've had that too, where I've had someone who had a night shift job, and obviously during the day that's their daytime, and they don't necessarily respect or understand what you are doing, and that you're at home, that means you're at work. It's having that structure, having that detachment can be very, very crucial. It's very easy just to kind of get out of that mentality. So, I mean, if I were to rattle off a few things right away, for me, I always would get up at a certain time of the day. I would always get dressed for work, which I think it sounds silly, but I would always get dressed for work. It also meant if I had clients to meet, that I would be ready to go and meet them right away. It's not like, okay, well, let me just shower and get dressed. At the same time, like for me, the biggest thing was that I would go out for breakfast every day or to get a coffee. And then when I came back, I would be actually coming back to the office. And it sounds kind of hokey, like, okay, well, that's awesome, but it's not really going to be that impactful. But it is like, for me, it's like when I get back to work, I'm at the office till 6 p.m. every day. And that's how I would start my day each day. And that way, just kind of having that, okay, I'm at the office. If something came up, you wanted to do something fun, it's like, all right, well, 6 p.m. I finish work. And you just have that kind of starting point, that chance to reset and initially start your day. So I think it's really good to kind of have that mentality of when you step outside the door and you come back in, you're not coming back into your house, you're coming into your home. So having a dedicated office space obviously is another key thing. Needing a personal environment. For me, like I actually like to work by myself rather than share it with other people who might be watching YouTube and, you know, doing their own thing. So for me, it's like I'm in the zone. This is my office. This is my business, my career. I need to take this seriously. I need to stick with this and get things done, deal with clients and everything else. Even, you know, getting your clients, like your employer or whatever it is, on chat, I think it's great just to kind of talk with them throughout the day. There is always that thing, though, that when you're on chat and someone messages you, and this can be the case, and you're not there, they're going to be like, where are you? What are you doing? And suddenly it paints the image of, you know, are you actually working every day, or, you know, just occasionally getting on chat? So having chat programs is one thing I find it can be really productive or counterproductive in the fact that they, you know, can catch you at the time when you just went to lunch, just as they message you, you don't come back for an hour, and then suddenly it's like, man, like it took an hour to respond, like what the hell are you doing? So there is always that fine line, and I kind of feel like you will need to validate that. It all changes when you're not dealing with employees, like employers, I should say. I find I rarely actually do work with employers these days. Like I typically will do things as a bid, treat it as a studio, and usually I hire staff. I, you know, have a lot bigger budgets to deal with. But initially, if you are just an employee working for a company, there is definitely that need to validate yourself constantly, and there's always going to be on both sides a bit of tension there, I think. So what I say by that is basically that when you're an employee, you're typically logging your hours. You're going to end up working a lot more hours than most people at the companies are, just because, again, I think that you kind of end up needing to validate yourself a lot more. Plus, I think that it also does come a bit of insecurity with dealing with that too. So like I said before, writing reports and kind of keeping people in the loop, I think, is very important to what you're doing. Basically, you want to constantly keep in communication with everyone that you work with. So having like a group chat going on, writing emails every day at the end of the day, just saying what you're doing, communicating where things are. All those things are, I think, are really important. It's going to keep people in the loop and keep them fed information about you. So it's obvious, like, man, you're really busy. You keep like hitting us up with more stuff, more everything. So you really need to kind of be on the aggressive side, on the offense, to validate what you're doing a lot more than people who are sitting in the office can, because they're physically there, and that is enough to it's going to showcase that. Now, like I said, there's a lot of psychology that comes into this, but you know, I do strongly think that as an employee working remotely, there definitely needs to be structure, and you need to constantly be in communication with everyone. I also think that there's a lot of tricks, which I will get into, but setting up a VPN, in other words, being on their network, is going to be very crucial, in my opinion. Doing the whole FTP thing, which I've done so many times, and I find that in 100 different ways, it's counterproductive, and it's not a good thing to do. What you can do is set up a VPN, which is a virtual private network, and you can talk to IT and talk with the managers about that, and basically to say, like, look, I want to be on the network so I can access files from home, and I can also put files up. And if you need to validate it, which is what I'm going to get into now anyway, basically, rather than giving someone a file, typically you're going to email a path. The production coordinator then will see it and they will download it. They don't know what to do with it, so they assign someone to go and open the file, put it in the right place it needs to be. There's always going to be issues that come up about maybe things aren't pathed correctly, they need to be repathed. Things take time and they're just suddenly become problematic. Setting up a VPN means that you can actually work off of their network, which means you save files where they need to. You send an email out. It's like, okay, well, everything's on G drive in this shot directory. You're essentially working with them the same way you would be if you were in the office. And that changes everything because it means that everything automatically will work. It's pathed where it needs to be. There's no mistakes. If you need to fix something, you can jump on there and take a look at the file yourself. Everything starts to fall into place. At the same time, it cuts down on miscommunication as well as feedback and everything else because people can open stuff right away. Like I said, the worst thing you want is for someone to open your file, render it out, and then people look at it, kind of like Superman Returns, where it's like, what is this? This isn't correct. And you don't know anything about this. You know, they just assume that the work they're looking at is your intention when maybe the point cache didn't work or some other issue is coming up. And instantly you looking at it, you'd be like, oh duh, that's the problem with that shot. But because you're not there, they're going to see it as like, okay, well, this is what we got. So keep that in mind. Like, you having access to the physical network is the next best thing to actually being in there. Now, going beyond that, and I was going to jump into this more later, but I might as well bring it up. While you also have access to the VPN, to the network, you can also remotely log into their machine. So in other words, if you had a dedicated node, it doesn't need to have a keyboard and mouse or anything, it just needs to be a box. That definitely can help too, because it means that you can remotely log in and use a machine on the network, which means that you can fire out renders, submit renders to the farm. You can load files up and double check what's going on their network. You can do a lot more with it. So sometimes that's actually faster than dealing with the bandwidth of sending gigabyte or terabyte files back and forth, like large caches and everything else, over the VPN. The VPN can be great, but using a remote desktop or also PCOIP, so PC over IP, that is something that means that you're just instantly sending your screen back and forth, and that's it, like the image back and forth. So that can be a lot quicker. And what I did on Transformers, actually, I initially worked on that all on site, and then as I wrapped up, Michael Bay had a couple of tweaks to one of the shots I was doing. So what I ended up doing was talking with the studio owner that I was working with, and basically saying, like, you know what, let me try and do these remote, because I actually want to see whether we can find a good solution for working this way. So I actually did it all through remote desktop, just the Microsoft Windows remote desktop, logging in and working on one of their machines remotely. That actually worked out really well. There's a little bit of lag, which I think was more my end. I needed a faster internet connection, but it meant I could effectively fire out sims on their network. And, you know, doing like a, let's say a fluid sim, that can be sometimes hundreds of gigabytes of data. So sending that to them obviously takes days sometimes to do, whereas doing it on their network was instant. The caches were there, I could fire out the sims. So it meant that I might make my initial changes on my end, and then when I'm ready, I log into a machine there and I start to work on the file on their systems. In other words, it's all pathed where it needs to be. I just run the simulation. When I'm ready, I start submitting all my render passes. The more you get into this, the more you start writing custom tools. That's when you can really get a lot of power. Like for Equalizer and a few other projects, I ended up developing a lot of custom tools, which meant that, you know, when my file's ready, I hit a button, it runs the sim, it then splits out my render passes into my matte pass, my fire, my smoke, my global illumination, interactive lighting passes. It'll do Z-depth, it'll do custom made ones, it'll actually modify things in my scene, create all these max files, submit them all to the farm, maybe even automatically build my nuke comp script and send that, you know, afterwards to the compositor or notify them where they are. Now, it sounds silly, but it isn't that hard to do. The technical director transformation course I put together was specifically on that, how to build pipelines and automate a lot of what you do, so that way you can just make more time for yourself to work and get things done a lot faster. So I really love that mentality. And when it came down to this, there was just a few of those tactics where I might have a button on my remote desktop machine. I hit that, and then on my local machine, I could remotely work on the file. And then when I hit a button, it submits it back to my machine over there. So I can just quickly jump between those two windows, and everything's automatically repathed where it needs to be. So that way it's local. I hit a button, it's published, it's actually on their network where it needs to be, and I can then run all the sims, the renders, and everything else to get it into comp. I did that a lot on Equalizer, and it meant that I had two machines, like two windows open no matter where I was, and it meant that I had that instant feedback to go back and forth between them. Again, building these tools up, the more time you put into the back end, in other words, like the initial work, the more later on the front end, you'll be able to get things done 100 times quicker. And that's when you start to propose to studios, okay, well, I'm ready to work, I'm ready to get all this done, I've got all these custom tools that allow me to work faster. You're not bullshitting them. You do have a lot of power that they mightn't have to actually get things done quicker. And because it is on your network, your workflow, each project, the pipeline and studio isn't changing, it means you've got a lot of control there. And that's just one of the things going into the whole working as not as an employee, but actually working as a studio. You can kind of structure things how you want. So that means that you are able to work a bit more independently. You're not saying, okay, well, I'm going to check in with you all the time. In other words, you're actually able to say, okay, well, I'm going to do this project. I'm going to get all these shots done. These are the days we're going to review stuff. If you have any updates or whatever, let me know. But then you go off and you do your work. As long as you keep consistent with everything you've agreed about, you're completely independent and able to do the work you need. You don't need to have that reassurance, which I think there's a big discomfort as an employee with being out of sight, out of mind. It's more out of sight, always on their mind. So being a company, being an entity, it's more you made that agreement about what you're doing, and then you go off and you do it, and you don't need to worry about things beyond that. There is major things that come with doing this, though. So keep in mind that when you do agree to work remotely, you're essentially playing with the big boys now. In other words, you aren't an employee, you aren't being told what to do, and you're not answering to your boss. And the worst you can do is maybe get fired or something along those lines. Suddenly, you now need to keep in mind all the overhead, and I'll get into that in a moment, but all the overhead that comes with this, as well as the responsibility of, like, if you miss your deadline, depending on who your client is and what you've agreed upon, you could very well get sued. You're dealing with actual, business. You're not just dealing with being an employee goofing off. Okay, and I think that's a big game changer for most people is, you treat yourself like, okay, I'm working from home, I'm being an employee. When you deal with deadlines, everything else, the companies are the ones liable for everything. In other words, they're the ones who have to go out and find the work. They're the ones who need to bid on the work. They're the ones who need to do all the client relations. They need to be the ones that hire all the staff. They need to manage the staff. They need to buy all the equipment, maintain all the equipment. They also need to have all the people that make it all function, especially in between all the artists and operators. There's a lot of other layers that go in between the producers, production coordinators, the supervisors, the IT, the client service people, receptionists, everything else you can imagine. Now, having all of these different layers, it's a big, massive machine. And at the front of it is the company entity. And, they're the ones agreeing, the producers are agreeing that they're going to get something done, and it needs to get done by a certain date, and all these other agreements that come into it. And you as an employee are just there to show up every day. And that's what it really comes down to. Like I said, the worst that can happen is you get fired. When you are a company entity, you are liable for yourself. You're also liable for all the other responsibilities that come into this. So keep that in mind too, that suddenly everything I just mentioned, you to some degree are going to need to fill those roles as well. And that's where the responsibility can sometimes crush people, because initially playing bartender or playing studio owner, it sounds like a great idea at first, but when you have all these layers of responsibility and time and stress, some people are just going to realize, you know what, like, this isn't worth it. This is going to slowly kill me, and the stress can get to you. Now, let me just kind of get into how to do this. And I've spent a lot of time just kind of educating you guys on a lot of the process on how a lot of this works, kind of leading up to this, just because most people, I don't think, are aware of like how it works and the experiences you can have, and that's why I've spent a good long time kind of going over that more than anything. But now, if you want to do this, if you wanted to step out and approach your company as, I want to work remotely, the best thing you can do is just to talk to them and say that, look, this is something I want to do for whatever reasons, or moving forward, this is how I want to propose working. The best thing you can do, and again, all that kind of stuff I will get into another time about the exact things to say, or email scripts like the ones I sent out today, but having the confidence, giving them the confidence, and that's something I brought up earlier about putting yourself in their shoes. What are their concerns? If you can provide a detailed outline of your workflow and what you want to provide them, in other words, if you can say, I'm going to work on these shots doing XYZ, these are what I intend to provide in the schedule. In other words, start to think like a producer and actually say, this is the deadline that I'm proposing, this is what I'm going to get done. These are the checkpoints to see where we're all at, so I can get feedback and everything else. Basically, give them an overview of the entire process, so that way they can start to see a blueprint of how all this stuff works. You need to also like walk them through your resources, and that is that, showing them that you're going to cover your own expenses when it comes to, I have a render farm at home, I have multiple machines to handle all this stuff, as well as all of my licenses and everything else. Really show that you're really capable, and that also reminds them also about the fact that these are expenses that typically they would need to take on their head. So by you having your own hardware, by having your own licenses, means that that's something they get for free with getting you in. For free meaning that you can work it into your budget if you need to, but for the most part, you're alleviating them of a lot of resources that typically they would need to worry about. Okay, so at this point, I think it's very important to talk the talk and walk the walk. In other words, you need to start thinking and talking like a producer. In other words, you need to not sell them on the idea of how about I work from home, but more importantly, show them logistics, show them your schedule, show them any numbers you can. Even you put together bids, review schedules, points in the day that you can say, or throughout the week that you can showcase where you're at and really track your progress. The more you can show a blueprint to them of what you intend to get done, the more comfortable they're going to be able to see where things are going. Because for a lot of people, when you're stepping outside of the comfort area that they're used to, there's a lot of things that could go wrong, and they need to be able to anticipate this. So if you just plain are not working the hours you should be, or you're actually working too many and they can't tell until you get give them the invoice, there's a lot of things that could go crazy. So for them, there's a lot of unknowns, and then it comes down to either you're just not going to deliver the quality that they've set out, or worse, you're just not delivering at all. You freak out and shut down and don't get anything done. There's a lot of things. So suddenly being out of their radar means that they're going to be more stressed about it and not knowing about like what kind of crazy things could come up. So being able to show them a blueprint of your plan of attack definitely is a much bigger selling point than trying to tell them about how great it's going to be and it's going to save them money. Show them what you intend to do. I mentioned this the last episode, but just briefly about one of the articles I wrote, and it's more about the fact that if you start to step up and really think independently and really start to look at the resources around you, how people work, and start to really accommodate that, the more you're able to talk the business side of things. In other words, saying like, look, this is all where everything's at, these are the problems that are coming up, alert people of these things, keep everyone in the loop, the more comfortable they're going to be with you, and the less people are going to be really micromanaging you, and the more confident, I should say, that they will be with you. And in other words, when it comes down to it, they're going to be more comfortable with, okay, if you need to work remotely out of the office, then we know that you will get the work done, so we're not uncomfortable with this. Whereas if you're constantly needing to get told what to do and be checked in on, and have the supervisors kind of really tell you how to make your work better, then they're never going to really feel that comfortable about, okay, well, can you do all this without the structure around you that we provide? In other words, can you be a self-sustained or self-contained artist and get what you need done? Another key thing is if you're able to actually give them more of a timeline. If you actually just say, let's try this for a month, and see how it works. I can save all this money, I can get everything done. Here's my plan of attack. I only do reviews on these days. I plan to deliver on these days for all the elements we have. Here's my proposed schedule. More importantly, after a month, let's reevaluate this, and if it's not working out, then we'll just go back to normal. And at the same time, if anywhere along the way you need to pull the plug, then we'll do that. Just by doing this, it gives them the option. It isn't like they're making this one-time decision that could change everything. It gives everyone the comfort of knowing that, okay, well, the worst case, if things aren't working out, we go back to how they were. And there's a lot more comfort and reassurance there, and more likeliness they'll say yes if you're able to say, look, let's try this out and see how it works. And if you're not comfortable at any time, we can pull the plug. Let's reevaluate in a month. And, if things aren't working out, then we'll go back to how things were. So I'll try and wrap this up, but if you want to work as a studio, if you want to start to make yourself your own entity and start to lead towards that, I'm not saying suddenly switch on I'm now a visual effects studio, but if you want to work remotely and you want to approach clients as a company entity, not as an employee, the key things you really need to really do is, first of all, when you approach them, you need to just outline that you've got all the resources you need. This is how you work. This is how you typically will approach things. You've got a lot of tools and everything at your disposal. In other words, give them comfort in knowing that, okay, well, you've got all the resources you need and that we need to get the job done. Beyond that, put together a bid. In other words, go through the process. And this is something I will dedicate an episode to, even for people who have experience bidding. It's always really fascinating to see how different studios do their process. But the best way to look at it is that you are going to put together a price of how much the whole thing will cost. And this gives a lot of comfort to producers, especially because typically when they're going to do a job, they need to designate a certain amount of money for the project. In other words, this shot or this effect, this whatever is going to be this much money. And then it's a matter of guessing it and hoping that the artists actually arrive on the right budget. So if you're able to actually say, okay, I'm going to do this for this amount of money, they can either say, okay, that's not what we budgeted for, or that fits perfectly, and they're comfortable knowing that that area is located, and you've essentially confirmed the price for them of what it's going to cost. I will say that it's important to at least cover your ass and make sure that you include revisions and everything else in there, or more, make sure they're aware of the process that you're going to do. So in other words, if they go and make changes and your budget's getting blown out, you need to educate them very early on about the path they're going down and how there's only so many revisions you can do, otherwise it's going to start to cost more money. And so that way you don't turn around like a dick and basically say, all right, I'm out of money, you need to pay me more money. And the worst thing you can do is take it on the head. In other words, say, okay, well, I'll do that, yes, 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 and keep saying yes to them. Meanwhile, your worth is essentially depleting. And beyond that, if you have your own expenses, if you have employees and everything else, and you've got to pay them, suddenly you're physically losing money. You're having to pay out people, and you could possibly take a loss. And I see that constantly, especially in visual effects. So keep that in mind, just to make sure that you will learn this as you get more experience with it, but you need to anticipate what clients are doing, how they're doing it. Make sure they're educated about the processes, because they might say, let's just have a quick splash, and a cat jumps in the water, not knowing that wet fur, dry fur, fluids, everything else that happens suddenly becomes a much, much bigger shot without ever taking any of that stuff into consideration. So again, the more educated they are about it without ever being aggressive about it, but just finding that subtle way to say, okay, we can do all this, so you're aware. The changes you specified actually have a lot of additional technical complications that come with it. For instance, with, let's say, a cat jumping in water, this typical shot is actually going to require additional shader development, as well as look development, as well as fluid simulations, additional things like that. So if we were to do this, it's quite possible it'll take more time and possibly more money. So I just want you to be aware of this before we go down it, just in case maybe there's other ways we could approach it, such as cutting the shot a little bit earlier before that splash, and then cutting to a new shot where the character's already wet, whatever it might be. Just thinking of solutions rather than just coming up with, yeah, this is a problem, it's going to cost more money, because for them, that's going to seem a lot more like resistance than it is going to be about, hey, just FYI, because I do this stuff and I know about it. This is commonly a problem, and the best solution I can give is this, this, and this. This one's the cheapest. This one might look the coolest, but it's going to cost more money. Which path do you want to go? By giving them 1, 2, or 3 options, you're actually solving the problem. They're going to give you more trust in what you're doing. So again, all that stuff kind of goes with experience, but it definitely can be a very powerful thing. So one of the key and most important things is to assemble a schedule and milestone deliveries, everything else. And by building this stuff, it kind of really gives them comfort in knowing where you're at. So if you're able to build a schedule of the entire production, as well as what dates you're going to be delivering certain things, and it might be, one thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to do several, like every week delivering stuff, because you get into this cycle of just trying to deliver, and you can very easily get consumed in that. And also just doing reviews and prepping material for reviews, that stuff can sometimes take up your entire day and multiple people's days. So you want to minimize these to sometimes, you're going to do a couple of reviews throughout the project, and then towards the end there'll be delivery schedules with maybe 1 or 2 revisions. You want to minimize them, batch the shots together, and that way, you're not wasting time just trying to do show and tells all the time. I've got a lot of tactics I do to kind of help anticipate that and make life a bit easier, but overall, that's something that can consume a lot of time. But I think it's very important to keep people on track with what they're doing and how it all works. So on top of that, just by having a review schedule, it's going to fit in with their schedule, and that's something that they can then promise to their clients and work it all into theirs. So the more you're able to show them your whole plan of attack and what you're doing, as long as you stay consistent with it, it's going to make everyone be on board, everyone's communicating, and everything's clear, and there's not going to be any hiccups. Now, at the same time, by not delivering your schedules, this instantly can derail everything. If you don't deliver what you promised, then you can have the project pulled. You can also get sued over it. There's a lot of different things. I mention all this because, like I said, if you're playing with the big boys, in other words, you're playing with actual clients and you're promising certain things and they're promising them to their clients, things can get hairy very quickly. So I mention this because you really need to make sure that everything that you promise to deliver, you do deliver. Otherwise, everything can go bad. And I've seen projects where if you don't deliver on a certain date, and it doesn't matter if you deliver and the client has changes, but if you don't deliver the shot for final on that date, then they could easily sue you over it. And all you want is to say, okay, well, here's our work, we're submitting as final, but we have, if you want to make some more changes, we're happy to do that. Director or whatever makes those changes, then you can go about it knowing that legally you've managed to stay consistent with what you're doing. There's a lot of things you just need to take into consideration, and that's why having schedule, milestones, all that stuff is essentially something that once you put it down, you're locked into it, and you cannot ever break it without a lot of renegotiation. And sometimes it's a matter of and again, it really depends on who you're dealing with. If you're dealing with Sony and some other bigger clients, it's rock solid. But if you're working with other companies, you might easily be able to say, okay, well, I'm not going to deliver this shot on the designated date. However, I will do these other 3 shots instead. And it's more about kind of gambling and trading up your schedule a little bit to restructure it. So there's a lot that goes into that, but it's something that you just need to keep in mind, that whatever you say in terms of reviews, milestones, all that stuff, when you agree to it, it's set in stone. Other things to take in consideration is when you look at yourself, you need a checklist of stuff that you need to start out. In other words, do you have the hardware and the resources you need to start? A lot of people will be like, yeah, I've got a computer, I can work from home. In fact, I have, I don't know, hundreds of times probably over my lifetime, had people reach out to me that they're doing a movie and they are going to be working from home. Should they get a faster computer? And they're basically saying that they're responsible for a big sequence in a film. To me, and I have had to say to them, like, do not do this, and think about what you're promising and what you can deliver. And just by saying, like, I have a computer, that should be warning bell number one. I mean, if you were a modeler, if you're someone doing something that the resources aren't too big, that typically is going to be fine. But as soon as you take into consideration the overhead it takes for rendering, for everything else, and the more experienced you are, the smarter you look at yourself and the mistakes that you make and the things that you typically run into, the problems that you run into on every project. And this is why it's important to do a post-mortem. In other words, write up a document every project you do, even just for yourself, just to say, okay, on this project, I anticipated this many days. It ended up being this many days. The problems I ran into were this. These are the things that went well. The more educated you are, and the more you need to kind of consolidate it all when you're writing it down, so you really begin to learn from it. But you need to acknowledge, like, okay, what are the mistakes I typically make? What are the issues that come up? Do I ever have enough resources? And if you say you're going to take on a project, you need to take into consideration, like, do I have the resources I need? God of War is a good one where I knew I would need a lot of hardware for doing that project. I ended up needing to buy a lot of hardware, rent for other artists, enough hardware, licenses, everything else. So that definitely was a big issue to kind of take into consideration. Also keep in mind, beyond the physical resources you need, like I said earlier, suddenly now you are the producer, you're the IT department, you are the junior artist who needs to do all the finicky stuff that you typically don't want to do. You need to take all this into consideration when you're doing a project. When you say you're going to do a shot, are you doing the entire shot? Are you doing the camera tracking? Are you doing the film conversion? Are you comping the shot? What are you exactly doing? There's a lot that comes into this, and you need to start to think about what actually is required and whether or not you can do it all. You know, sometimes it might be just a matter of educating your client too about, okay, I can do all this, but we need the shot tracked and we need to have like geometry and everything else tracked too, as well as the assets built. That's something that I don't want to do because I'm going to be busy focusing on all the other aspects, so you guys need to handle that. Okay, saying that is important because otherwise you're going to get the footage one day and you're stuck with, well, I didn't say I'm going to do this, this, and this, but you have agreed to do the shot without educating them about these things. At the same time, you can also say, okay, well, you know, in the bid, these are the additional things we need. We need a trackers, need this, this, and this. So I need a bigger budget to bring these people on. So it's up to you. Personally, I actually like when I can to put that stuff onto someone else. Camera tracking and comping, again, I'm happy to do that, but it really comes down to a couple of things. Camera tracking, all that sort of stuff. If I get a really tricky shot and I didn't anticipate, especially not seeing the footage initially, how bad the track's going to be, maybe that's going to end up taking a lot longer than anticipated. So for instance, at the beginning when initially these things are being figured out, sometimes it's better to kind of leave that on someone else, so that way you're not liable for things that could go wrong in the beginning. And that way, whatever you get is going to end up being safe and ready to rock. At the same time with comping, I can always hire. I've got a great resource of talented compositors at my disposal. I can hire John Brennick, I mentioned before, and a lot of other talented guys. Now, taking that into consideration, there's also the fact that you got to think about, okay, well, if I'm comping shots, then I have to deal with client approval. In other words, all the work I've done so far that's getting approved is one thing, but suddenly I need to think about the client and all the little fixes they might need with wire removal, with other things, little glitches in the shots. The what if would be, this would be great to have. I've had that a few times where it's like, well, if I don't cover the comping, it'd be great to get the additional 30% or whatever I'm going to get from having the shots to comp as well. But suddenly you're responsible for the final approval, which is typically where a lot of clients are going to ask for the world. And all the things that they didn't anticipate or didn't think of in the beginning are then going to, suddenly get lapped in there as well. So for me, kind of being in the middle sometimes is a good safety area. And it just depends. If I want to take on an entire sequence and say, we'll do the start to finish, great. But there are some times where I know that if I do like a 80-20 analysis on it, in other words, usually 80% of the results come from 20% of the data that you're dealing with. So in other words, for me, I might look at, okay, well, I'm getting the 3D stuff done very quickly, but then there's the finicky stuff at the beginning that really set us back, just getting the wrong plates and the wrong track and the wrong data. And then at the very end, the clients start asking for all this additional stuff. There are issues with trying to get a few of the things to work, and they just wouldn't approve it. We ended up doing 60 versions in comp, whereas there was only about 3 or 4 versions in 3D. If you look at that, then maybe you realize that the 3D area is something that you can actually make the most profit from, the least amount of time on it as well, less stress, less hiccups, and then you're all good. Whereas the other way around, maybe not doing the 3D, doing all the comp means that you're able to get all the assets and you can kick it back to 3D if you need to. Therefore, it's just about seeing the shots as final, doing the grade and everything else. Whatever it's going to be, but you evaluate where the sticking points are, and that's why writing those postmortems, figuring out like, okay, where in the project did it go wrong? If it does go wrong, you can start to figure that out. And sometimes you deal with clients that you figure are actually a pain in the butt to deal with, and they're actually costing you a lot of money. I've had clients that I've had to kind of politely dodge because I know that if I were to take on the project, it might be great, but the amount of hassle that's going to come into it is going to be a nightmare. And for me to be able to just say, okay, well, I'm not going to do that project because it's a small project, yet it's probably going to take up most of my time. And I've had that. I've had a very high profile project, I think it was last year, and I didn't pay much, a couple $1,000, whereas other projects which were much bigger ended up like getting done fine. But because I had this one project that wouldn't go away and ended up taking up all my resources, everything for months ended up becoming a nightmare. And it's just about identifying those nightmares, and it's okay to have them occasionally as long as you identify, okay, well, why were they a nightmare? Was I not prepared properly? Or sometimes it's the client, and in this one situation it was. I basically had a client that would give me feedback about stuff that needed to be absolutely done by morning, and it's very intense, and then come back in the next morning basically saying that, okay, well, we just got client feedback because we went and showed them all the stuff that you did right after we talked to you. So in other words, everything that I had gone through the night doing was irrelevant because now the client who actually is giving them direction has finally actually given them the feedback that counts. So doing this endless loop of derailing the project over and over and over means that nothing's going to get done, whereas waiting an hour for the proper client feedback, giving you the plan of attack, everyone stays consistent. And that's why I love working on projects where everyone's staying on track and doing what needs to get done and doing it the right way. Final thing I'll say about this is, where in the pipeline are you? In other words, when you're deciding whether or not to work from home, where in the pipeline are you? Are you at the beginning in pre-production, in actual development? Are you at the very end of the pipeline? In other words, if I were to hire someone remotely to model, sculpt characters, that's fine because it's something that other people aren't relying on them. It's not part of the production process. It's initially generating assets. From there, they can supply the assets and then we go into production. Hiring someone to do effects remotely, which is what I do a lot of, that's a lot more of a gamble because you're waiting for assets to come in from animation, from modeling, lighting, everything else. They then feed through you and then need to be distributed back into the studio again for comp and everything else. So especially if you're doing assets and everything else that then need to go through lighting and rendering, that's a lot more of a problem because it's right in the middle. Same thing if you were to outsource animation. Again, that would reflect on so many people that further down the pipeline, it becomes a lot more of a risk to hire people remotely. And you need to take into consideration yourself as a remote worker about whether or not it's viable for you to do that, because communication, everything else, usually at the end of the project, a lot of the initial schedule has been eaten up, and then at the very end of it is where it all kind of gets hectic. So, you're suddenly needing to turn things around a lot quicker, and that can become an issue. Now, just keep that in mind. Like, is it sensible for you to be doing that? I mean, if you were a compositor working remotely, you need to deal with a lot of high bandwidth, a lot of high resolution plates going back and forth, new stuff coming in every day. There's going to be new elements, new adjustments. It probably doesn't make sense for you to work remote. As much as it might be great to do it, it just probably doesn't make sense. So you need to evaluate, even though you think you're talented and you're experienced and you could rock at doing your own stuff, if you're relying on other people and constant communication back and forth, is it actually viable that you do this? Now, one last thing I'll add to that is that typically with a lot of clients, I might say to them that I'm not going to deliver assets to them. If I'm doing, let's say, effects, I mightn't give them simulated data back, because I just know that for me to send gigabytes of data, everything else, it's going to be a pain. So what I might suggest is either I give them the models and the final assets, and they simulate it on their end and they see it through, which is great because it means that any render tweaks or anything else is on them, and it's probably not going to get bounced back to me. And it's probably more cost effective for them because they have on-site staff who might be cheaper and everything else as well. But at the same time, there are situations where, and this is a lot of the time, I will actually say, well, I'm going to deliver you rendered elements. In other words, what you'll see from me are rendered passes. In other words, I'll get the lighting done on my end. I'll get everything else done on my end. So I'm the end of my pipeline, and then rendered elements go back to them, and that's it. So it will go into comp, they'll see it in context, then they'll give me feedback. I make my revisions, render it all out, and submit rendered assets back to them, rendered elements. So that's important because it means that you are the end of your pipeline. There's not as much back and forth. You might get updates on assets or whatever, but that's all you really need to take in consideration. Whereas you're rendering stuff out, and that's what they get back. So there's no chance for things to go wrong, be misinterpreted, for them to not do a good job of lighting it or whatever else. You're in control of the final output, and it just goes into comp from there. So it's a lot lighter, a lot easier, and it's more about just thinking about the overall process and keeping things consistent. Where are things possibly going to go wrong? If I'm building effects assets, I give it to them, they've got new assets on their end or whatever else. Nobody knows, there's miscommunications, lots of things can go wrong. It's slow to get stuff back, to simulate it, whatever else. Maybe it's quicker to do on your end. Just consider all the logistics and find what makes the most sense for you in the way that you work. Now, the final bits, and I'm going to wrap this up, which this has been a long episode. Again, I'm just touching the surface on a lot of this stuff, but there are a few different ways to work. Like I said, I don't suggest doing the FTP route. I think that is completely backwards these days and doesn't work. I think that working solely remote on your own network and doing everything else is fine. In other words, they deliver assets to you, you get the work done. You just need to figure out what the final output's going to be, and again, communicate to them what it's going to be, so that way they're in the loop as well, in case they want assets back from you or whatever it's going to be. And that's also going to reflect on what kind of hardware and everything else you need as well. If you're not doing the lighting, great. If you need to light all your elements, maybe you need to hire a lighter just to be able to handle that because you're busy juggling shots. Everything else, just think about the entire process from a 5,000 foot view looking down, So doing that is fine, but keep in mind what is the final output. Working remotely on their network through remote login or VNC, whatever it's going to be, is very effective as well. If you look at ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, they did this on a few films about 2 years ago. They tested out this model, which is that they had the ILM pod, the LA pod, which basically meant that they were all PCOIP. So in other words, they were basically a computer, a keyboard, and a mouse. So a screen, a keyboard, and a mouse. And all they needed was a network cable, which would plug into the internet. It would go all the way to the servers in San Francisco in the Presidio, and the actual physical computer they're working from is on the network. That's really effective because it meant that all the files are in one location. There's no need for heavy bandwidth other than to get your screen refreshing constantly. And there is like a lag. It's more of a microsecond. So you notice it as soon as you touch the mouse, but after that it goes away and you don't, you forget that you're dealing with it. Now, the worst that can happen is the machine crashes and you need to call IT in San Francisco and say, reboot my machine, because you can't do it on your end. But that way of working can be really effective, and it's just a matter of how you want to get set up. But I like that idea. I was in Vegas last week. I was talking with a good friend of mine. He actually mentioned that he had someone remotely logging into the machine behind him, and coincidentally he actually set up a webcam with the screen behind him too, so whenever he looked around, the other guy had the webcam on his end, they could actually see each other 24 hours a day, the whole time they were working. So I like that idea, just because as freaky as it is, you can virtually see someone physically there, sitting where they should be. I think that he actually had it set up as a webcam on the back of his head, so that way you are actually looking at the back of their head as if they're sitting there, which is kind of freaky in a way. So hi Sol, if you're listening, but I did find that kind of amusing. But again, finding the way that works really intuitively for you and the companies you work for is really important if you want this to actually last. Now, beyond that, obviously VPN, doing a virtual private network, being on their network, I think is probably one of the most effective ways. I think a combination of doing a VPN and remote desktop works really well, especially if you write the tools to make it really fluent. It's still not ideal. On Equalizer, I was working from 2 locations, Boston and LA, and going back and forth was, trying to switch back and forth as well each time. It definitely wasn't the best situation, but you can make it work. Doing PCOIP is definitely by far the best solution in my opinion, and if you can get that working, then it makes a world of difference. The only thing is sometimes reviewing shots, like doing 2K plates streaming, can get kind of laggy depending on your bandwidth and everything else. Beyond that, so yeah, like I said, on flight, I would actually work offline, in other words, on my own network, and then it came to publishing, I would log into my client's network in San Francisco. I would publish the elements there, run the sims there, run the renders there. They would be in the correct location where they need to. If they need to tweak my shots themselves, they can open up my files and work on them. So that could be pretty effective as well. So yeah, like I said, don't do VPN is the last thing I was going to say about that. Now, this is pretty much it. Again, this episode's gone a lot longer than I wanted, but it's just such a big subject. And if there is interest in doing this, I will definitely start segmenting this down into very hands-on, like here's the scripts that I use, like here's the emails that I use, here are examples of workflow, everything else. Here's how I approach clients, here's how I bid on shows, here's how I would set up my own entity, and here's how I would attract services without me needing to approach them. Here's actual letters I would mail out to Warner Brothers and other companies on how to get movie work. There's a lot of that stuff. So like I said before, I do get a lot of people asking, could I do this starting out? I strongly disagree, because I think you need that experience to become independent and get good at that, as well as get into the mindset of dealing with clients and everything else, because you need to manage yourself and get really good at that too. Again, I'm happy to give out spreadsheets and teach you guys how to manage yourself in that way too. I think that's probably been the most valuable thing for me, was getting into that mindset of managing myself and managing multiple projects, hundreds of shots through databases and everything else. Just meant that I could see where things are at, what needs attention, what's the status of things, so that way I can report that stuff back. I can see where there's problems or things that got lost. There's a book very popular, The 4-Hour Workweek, Tim Ferriss wrote. I think it's a brilliant book. It doesn't really apply to 3D as much as I do think that it's just a great idea to kind of start thinking about how to get out of that mindset of necessarily doing the 9 to 5 and killing yourself for the sake of staying busy. I think being productive is a lot better than being busy. So there's definitely like a lot of books on that sort of stuff that I do recommend. So at this point, I'd really love to hear what your thoughts are. Now, obviously, this is a pretty broad subject, so I'm kind of more just scratching the surface, like I said, but I'd like to know what your thoughts are about this whole thing, about your experiences maybe working from home, or whether that's something that does interest you. If you can do this, and that is just leave a comment below on my page. So in other words, if you go to www.allanmckay.com, so ALLANMCKAY.com/12 for episode 12. Please just spend a moment again after doing an hour and a half on this. It'd be great to kind of hear some feedback and just kind of see what you think about the subject, about your thoughts on working remotely. But more importantly, are you interested in this subject about more building up to that level of becoming your own entity? So it doesn't necessarily mean starting your own company and having that much responsibility, but gaining the freedom to really become like a strong independent entity and be able to get a lot of this work and be able to pitch and attract a lot of bigger projects, be able to essentially collaborate with a lot of studios doing this sort of thing. If this is something that interests you, I'll definitely put out more content on it. So it's something that I'm just more interested in gauging how far down the rabbit hole I really want to go on this, because like I said, I've been doing this the last 10 years and I work in every shape and form, but it's definitely something I've been very successful with on working on feature films and also a lot of high-end projects, all remotely from the comfort of my desk at home. Obviously, I have a large render farm, I've got a lot of resources, I hire people. I do have an office in Santa Monica, which these days I've downsized quite a lot for the time being, but again, those are for more the larger projects I've needed to take that on, which you don't necessarily need. It's just, obviously, there's been times where I've had those 7-figure projects come in that you need to anticipate and coordinate for. All of that being said, sign up for the VIP list if you haven't already. Today I sent out an email. This will be the first of many, which was a PDF of an actual email script about how to apply for work. So in other words, I wrote down exactly how to approach work and broke it down sentence by sentence, literally, to a lot of the invisible threads about how to indirectly ask for things, how to qualify yourself, how to approach obstacles, things you can do to initiate and continue the conversation so people kind of feel required to respond to what you're emailing them. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this, and it's not meant to be manipulative in any way, but it is something that just having strong conversation and communication skills, it actually takes some time to actually work on what you're doing and work on how you're going to approach things so that way you get a desired response or a desired result. Now, all of that being said, next episode, which will be this coming Friday, I'm going to be putting out something which I think is going to be really fun, and this is a bit more on the area of more life hacking than anything, but I think it's very powerful, and that is that I want to go through building your morning ritual. In other words, getting more time in your day, getting more energy in your day to do things, structuring your day better. Many successful people I know, as well as just in general, it's a very powerful thing to have, is to be able to how to approach your day from the beginning, be able to get more time to get things done, as well as get an additional 5 hours out of your day every day. So for me, being able to wake up and instantly start approaching my calendar, my schedule, get things done, it makes a world of difference, especially if, for instance, you are got a day job and you want to break away from that. If you want to work on your own goals, whether it's your short film, whether it's about setting up a second business, whether it's about building a reel so you can break away from the job that you do now that you're not as happy with and get into visual effects or whatever your desired career might be. Maybe it's to get out of visual effects, who knows? But for me, this has been the massive game changer. Probably one of the big things I owe everything to was being able to build a constant and solid routine and get more energy, get more out of my day, so that way by structuring it all, I can wake up and start kicking ass and get most of my day done by the time 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. comes around. So I think that's a good valid question, is like, what would you do if you had an additional 5 hours in your day? What are the things that you're trying to do and you just don't have time for? Okay, is there an additional goal you want to set, whether you want to learn something new, whether you want to study and do courses or other things in the morning, whether it's time to go to the gym or have time to get things done. So next episode is going to be on hacking your morning schedule, your morning ritual, to be able to get more out of your day and make an impact in your day and simply get a additional 5 hours out of your day. So I think this is going to be a fun one. There's definitely a lot that goes into it. And again, this is all about the path of December being about making an impact, making big changes in our habits and what we do, learning a lot of new skills and new talents to go out and do what we do. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got a lot out of it. Definitely one of the longer episodes I've put together, especially as a solo episode. But again, there's just so much here. And I do think it's important to educate you about what are your motives behind doing work remotely or working, a second job, whatever it's going to be. Figure out why your motives are, because sometimes it is just you want to be the man and get out of this, but you got to understand the responsibilities that come with it too. So keep that in mind. I think it's a very crucial thing as you move forward. All that being said, next episode, let's hit it hard, and also leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and again, putting in over an hour and a half of content here. I'd love to get some feedback about it, because that way I can really start to focus more on some of the more specific areas. So tell me what your thoughts are and whether or not you find this information really valuable to your life, and what you would be able to achieve if you had more time in the day to work remotely and avoid the clutter of typically working from an office. All right, so that's it for now. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you guys next episode. Leave a comment, hit me up on Facebook, and that's it.